My name is Lauren Hayes. I am 33 years old. 11 years ago, my mother betrayed me by secretly selling the family heirloom jewelry my grandmother had left specifically for my college fund and using every penny to cover my older sister's failed business venture, without ever admitting it even after I found out. That lie left me feeling worthless and taught me exactly how little my own worth mattered to her unless I fit her perfect picture. Now everything is colliding right here in this crowded lawyer's office for the reading of my great aunt's will, where my mother is already arguing that I should sign away my share because my so called unstable tech job offers nothing to the family, while my older sister has always been the reliable one. My hands are shaking, but I am done letting her control me with guilt, and I am ready to show her the truth I have hidden for 17 months, no matter what it costs. If you have ever felt like your own mother, measured your value by how well you served her image of the family, hit that like button right now and tell me in the comments what she said or did that made you question everything, because I read every single one, and knowing I'm not alone makes this a little easier to share. I grew up in the suburbs outside Denver, always hearing my mother compare me to my older sister in ways that cut deeper than any argument ever could. My older sister was the one who married well right after college, the one who gave her the grandchildren she bragged about at every neighborhood barbecue, the one whose life looked polished on the outside. I was the one who chose a career in tech, the one who never quite measured up in my mother's eyes, even though I had quietly built something most people only dream about. My grandmother had raised me with a different lesson after my parents passed when I was 9 years old. She taught me that real character shows itself only when someone believes you have nothing left to offer them. She lived simply despite having built and sold a small chain of gift shops that left her comfortable. And when she passed 7 years ago, she left me everything, along with a letter that still sits in my nightstand. That letter reminded me to never let money or status define how people treat me. So when I started dating my fiance 17 months ago, and my mother immediately began dropping hints that he came from a good family with connections, but that I needed to prove I could fit into that world, I made a choice. I never lied to my fiance. When we met at a local coffee shop, he asked what I did, and I said I worked in tech supporting the team. He filled in the blanks himself, assuming I was an administrative assistant, barely scraping by on a modest paycheck. I let him believe it. I wore the simple clothes, drove my 10-year-old sedan, and smiled through my mother's constant jabs about how I needed to find a more stable path. Why did I do it? Because I needed to know if the woman who had raised me would treat me with basic respect when she thought I brought nothing to the table. I needed to know before I let my fiancé propose, because families, as my grandmother always said, are forever, and I refused to marry into more of the same emotional coercion I had grown up with. The will reading was supposed to be straightforward, a simple afternoon in lawyer Michael Lawson's office to divide my great-aunt's modest estate among the relatives. My father had suggested we all attend together to keep things civil, but from the moment we walked in, I felt the tension crackle like static before a storm. My mother sat at the head of the long oak table, her posture perfect, her voice already laced with that familiar mix of sweetness and venom. She introduced me to Michael as her younger daughter, who worked in some vague support role, and I watched his eyebrows lift slightly, but he said nothing. My fiancé sat beside me, squeezing my hand, looking proud, even though he still believed I could barely afford my half of the rent. My older sister arrived late, with her husband Derek Morgan in tow, her designer bag swinging like a trophy. My mother wasted no time. She leaned across the table and said, in that quiet, cutting tone she reserved for family, "Only Lauren, I hope you understand that with your limited income, we cannot expect you to contribute much to the estate taxes. So it would be best if you simply step aside and let your older sister handle the details." The words landed like a slap, but I kept my face neutral. I had come prepared to listen, not react. My father cleared his throat suddenly, his voice rising in a way I had never heard before. "Evelyn, that is enough. She is our daughter, and she has every right to be here." He pushed his chair back and walked out of the room for a moment, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving an awkward silence that felt heavier than any argument. It was not the usual quiet discomfort. It was a sharp, frustrated interruption that told me even he was tired of her games, but he still would not fully stand up to her later. I excused myself to the hallway to catch my breath, and that is when I heard their voices through the half-open door of the small conference room next to us. My mother and my older sister were speaking in low, urgent tones, the kind that carried the weight of long-held plans. My mother said the stores are barely hanging on another quarter like this, and we lose everything. My older sister agreed. The merger with Madison Klein's family distribution network is the only way out, and my fiancé is useful for now, but he needs to see that Lauren is not the future. They laughed softly, my mother adding that I was always so naive, grateful for any attention I got, and that once the will was settled, they could pressure me to move back home and help run the stores full-time, like a good daughter should. The words hit me like ice water. This was not just snobbery. This was a calculated scheme to use me as a placeholder while they maneuvered my fiancé toward Madison, whose family could save their failing retail chain. I stood there frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears, but I did not burst in, not yet. I had spent 17 months playing the modest, supportive girlfriend for a reason, and now I understood the stakes were higher than I imagined. My mother had always used guilt and obligation to keep me in line, reminding me that family came first, that my choices had disappointed her for years. This was the same emotional coercion wrapped in new packaging. I slipped back into the main room just as Michael Lawson began reading the will. My mother shot me a quick glance, her smile tight with that hidden contempt I knew too well. My fiancé leaned over and whispered that everything would be fine, but I could see the confusion in his eyes when my mother made another pointed remark about how some people in the family had to work ordinary jobs while others built real legacies. The reading dragged on with small bequests and legal language that blurred together, but my mind was already racing ahead. I knew I needed proof. Later that afternoon, after we left the office, I called my best friend Emma Caldwell, the one person who had always seen through my mother's act. Emma worked in finance, and she agreed to help me quietly dig into the retail chain's records. She said, "Lauren, if this is as bad as you think, we can find the numbers, but you have to decide if you are ready to burn it all down." Her words hung in the air like a warning. That night, my fiancé and I had dinner at our small apartment, and he mentioned how nice it would be if I could spend more time with my family now that the will was settled. I smiled and said I would think about it, but inside, I felt the first real crack in the foundation we had built. The next morning, Emma sent me the first batch of documents she had pulled from public filings. The chain of 3 retail stores my mother and my father had run for decades was drowning in debt expanded too fast during the good years, now facing renewal deadlines on their supplier contracts. The merger with Madison Klein's family was not just convenient, it was desperate. I stared at the spreadsheets, my stomach twisting, because I realized my mother had been gaslighting me for months, telling me my tech job was cute but not real, while she secretly viewed me as a tool to keep my fiancé occupied until the right alliance could be secured. I printed everything and hid the folder in my closet. 2 days later, my mother called me at work, her voice dripping with false concern. "Lauren, I know you are busy with your little office tasks, but the family needs you at the store this weekend to help with inventory. It is the least you can do after everything we have given you." I felt the familiar pull of obligation, the guilt she wielded like a weapon, but I told her I had deadlines. She sighed, that long-suffering sound she perfected over the years, and said some daughters understand what loyalty means without being asked twice. I hung up and immediately texted Emma. The second mini cliffhanger hit when Emma replied that she had found something even bigger. My mother's personal accounts showed small but consistent transfers that looked like they were covering personal expenses while the business bled. I knew then that the test I had set for my mother was about to become something far more dangerous. My fiancé came home that evening, carrying flowers and talking about how my family had invited us to a small gathering at the community center next week to celebrate my father's retirement. He said my mother had specifically asked that I dress nicely because important people would be there. I nodded and smiled, but my mind was already turning over the folder in my closet and the conversation I had overheard. I wondered how long I could keep playing the role before the truth I had hidden for 17 months, the patents I held, the stock options that made my salary $45,000 a month, the life I had built quietly on my own terms, would finally demand to be seen. My father called me privately. The next afternoon, his voice low and frustrated in a way that shocked me. He said, "Lauren, your mother means well, but she is worried about the business, and sometimes she pushes too hard." I wanted to believe him, but the way he had stormed out of the lawyer's office and then returned as if nothing happened left me with a sick feeling that even he was part of the quiet coercion, keeping the family image intact. I told him I understood and hung up, but the weight of it all settled heavier on my chest. Emma met me for coffee that evening, her eyes wide, as she slid another stack of papers across the table. She whispered that if the transfers continued, the business could face an audit, and that my mother had been using family funds in ways that could unravel everything. I stared at the documents, feeling the ground shift beneath me. The gathering at the community center arrived on a crisp Saturday afternoon, and from the moment I walked through the doors, carrying a tray of appetizers, my mother had insisted I pick up my older sister, pulled me aside with a bright smile that did not reach her eyes. She said in a low voice that Madison had just arrived, and it would be best if I stayed in the background, helping with the refreshments, since my mother had everything under control. I set the tray down and scanned the room, spotting Madison Klein, a polished woman in her late 30s, laughing with a group near the punch bowl. Her family connections clearly the star of the afternoon. My mother spotted me across the hall and made a beeline straight for me, her heels clicking with purpose. "Lauren," she said loud enough for a few nearby guests to hear, "I see you made it. But honestly, with your limited experience in real business, it might be better if you let your older sister and me handle the introductions." The words were delivered with that biting sarcasm she wielded like a knife, making it crystal clear that in her eyes, I was still the daughter who had never quite measured up. My father stood a few feet away, talking to one of the older guests, and when he overheard her remark, his face shifted into something I had not seen before, a flash of quiet anger that tightened his jaw before he stepped forward and said in a firm tone, "Evelyn, enough. Lauren is here to support the family, not to be sidelined." It was not the awkward deflection I had come to expect from him. Instead, it felt like a sudden private confrontation, brewing right there in public, his voice carrying an edge of frustration that surprised even my mother. She shot him a look that could have frozen the punch bowl, but he held his ground for a moment longer before turning away to speak with someone else, leaving the air thick with tension. My mother recovered quickly, grabbing my arm and steering me toward a side table where she whispered that my father's little outburst changed nothing, and that if I truly cared about the family, I would stop making everything so difficult. The afternoon dragged on with toasts and small talk, but every interaction felt loaded. My fiancé spent most of the time chatting with Madison, his laughter a little too loud, and I caught my mother watching them with obvious approval, her hand resting on my older sister's shoulder, as if the two of them shared a secret plan that did not include me. I stayed busy refilling glasses and clearing plates, playing the supportive role I had perfected over 17 months. But inside the folder of evidence burned in my mind like a live wire. Emma had texted me earlier, warning that one more discovery she had made could blow the whole thing open, and I felt the suspense building because I knew the moment I revealed my real salary, the patents and the life I had hidden would shatter the illusion my mother had built around me. As the event wound down, my mother cornered me near the exit, her voice dropping to that venomous whisper she saved for when she thought no one else could hear. "Lauren," she said, "you have always been the one who needed extra guidance. And now, with the stores in a delicate position, it is time you finally stepped up and moved closer to help full-time. Your tech work is fine for a hobby, but family comes first, and if you cannot see that, then maybe you do not belong here at all." The psychological jab hit deep, exposing the long-held resentment she had never fully voiced before, making it clear that my autonomy, my choices, my entire identity had always been something she wanted to suppress and reshape. I felt my stomach drop, but before I could respond, my father appeared at my side again, his expression a mix of exhaustion and resolve. He pulled me aside privately later in the parking lot and said in a hushed, urgent tone that he could not keep watching her treat me this way, but that speaking up fully would tear the family apart, and he was not sure he had the strength for that kind of break. It was a shocking admission that left me standing there stunned, because for the first time, he was acknowledging the pattern without dismissing it, yet still choosing the path of least resistance. I drove home that night with my fiancé in the passenger seat, talking about how successful the gathering had been and how my mother had mentioned Madison's interest in a follow-up meeting. He reached over and squeezed my knee, saying maybe it was time I considered what my mother was suggesting about helping the stores, but his words only amplified the fracture I had been feeling. When we got back to the apartment, I waited until he fell asleep, then pulled the folder from the closet and stared at the pages knowing the next step would change everything. Emma had left one last message on my phone that evening, a single line that made my blood run cold. She had found proof that my mother had already started drafting paperwork to transfer a portion of the inheritance shares directly to my older sister under the guise of business stability. The discovery sat there like a final warning, because if I did not act soon, the woman who had raised me would erase my place in the family completely, and I would be left with nothing but the painful choice of walking away or staying silent forever. The next few days passed in a haze of forced normalcy that only made the folder in my closet feel heavier every time I glanced at it. I went through the motions at work, finishing code reviews and leading a team meeting on a new project rollout. But my mind kept circling back to the documents Emma had uncovered and the way my mother had spoken about me, as if I were nothing more than a convenient placeholder. My fiancé noticed I seemed distant and asked if the will reading had rattled me, but I brushed it off with a smile, telling him it was just work stress. Inside, I felt the first real fracture forming between us, because the man I had fallen for still believed the version of me I had let him see, and I was starting to wonder if that version was the only one he could handle. My mother called again the morning before the follow-up family meeting at our old house, her voice carrying that familiar edge of false sweetness that always preceded a demand. "Lauren," she said without any greeting, "I expect you to be there early tomorrow to help set up the tables and make sure everything looks presentable for the guests. Your little tech job can wait for one afternoon, and besides, your older sister has been handling most of the planning while you hide behind your screen." The jab landed exactly where she knew it would, reminding me once more that my career was just a cute hobby in her eyes. I gripped the phone tighter and told her I would try, but she cut me off with a sigh that carried years of disappointment. Some daughters understand what family loyalty looks like without needing constant reminders. She added her tone, laced with that cold sarcasm that made it clear she had already decided I was the problem. I hung up, feeling the anger rise hot in my chest, but I did not argue back yet, because the plan I had been building required me to stay quiet just a little longer. Emma met me at a quiet cafe near my office that same afternoon, sliding a fresh envelope across the table with a serious look in her eyes. She had pulled more records overnight, and what she found made the retail chain's troubles look even worse than I had imagined. The supplier contracts were set to expire in 3 months, and without the merger through Madison Klein's distribution network, the whole operation could fold, leaving my parents with mounting debts that had been quietly piling up for 4 years. Emma leaned in and whispered that the transfers from the business accounts to my mother's personal credit cards were not small mistakes. They were deliberate, and if anyone dug deeper, it could trigger an audit that might expose everything. I stared at the papers, feeling a second mini cliffhanger hit me hard, because this was no longer just emotional coercion. It was a financial house of cards that my mother had built on the assumption that I would always be the reliable backup who asked no questions. The family meeting at the house unfolded on a quiet Thursday evening, the same living room where I had spent so many holidays feeling like the afterthought. My mother greeted us at the door, her smile tight and her eyes already scanning me for any sign of resistance. She pulled me aside before the others arrived and said in that low, venomous tone she mastered years ago, "Lauren, I hope you have thought about what I said at the community center, because with your background in that little support role, you really should not be making waves about the inheritance. It is time you finally contributed something useful instead of hiding behind your screen." The psychological jab cut straight to the bone, laced with the long-held resentment that I had never quite fit the image she wanted for her younger daughter. My fiance overheard the tail end of it and shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, his silence another small crack in the foundation I had been ignoring. My father arrived from the kitchen, carrying coffee mugs, his face already showing the strain of another evening under my mother's direction. When my mother repeated her comment louder this time, for the whole group to hear, he reacted with a sharp intake of breath that turned into an immediate defensive outburst. "Evelyn, stop!" He snapped his voice louder than I had ever heard it directed at her. "I will not sit here and watch you diminish our daughter again. She has every right to her opinions and her share." The reaction was completely different from the quiet anger or private admissions he had shown before. It was raw frustration spilling out in front of everyone, leaving my mother momentarily stunned before she recovered with a dismissive wave of her hand. My older sister and her husband Derek exchanged glances. My older sister adding with a smirk that some people always had to make everything dramatic, while Derek nodded along, saying it was better for family harmony if everyone just agreed on the practical steps. We sat around the dining table, the folder burning in my bag, as my mother steered the conversation straight toward the business troubles, framing the merger with Madison's family as the only logical path forward. She looked directly at my fiancé and said with that cold sarcasm, dripping from every word, it would be wonderful if certain people in this family stopped playing at careers and started supporting real stability instead of expecting handouts. The words were aimed squarely at me, exposing the identity suppression she had practiced for years, trying to erase the autonomy I had built. I felt my hands tremble under the table, but I waited until Madison Klein herself joined via video call on the laptop my mother had set up, her polished face filling the screen as she discussed distribution networks and investment terms. That was when I stood up, pulled the folder from my bag, and placed it on the table with a quiet thud. My mother's eyes narrowed instantly. "What is this, Lauren?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory, as if I had already committed some unforgivable betrayal. I took a deep breath and began speaking, my voice steady, but laced with the anger I had held back for 17 months. I explained that I had never been the administrative assistant. Everyone assumed I was that. I was a senior software architect with 3 patents and a salary of $45,000 a month before taxes. I laid out the documents showing the retail chain's 4 years of mounting debt, the supplier contracts at risk, and the suspicious transfers from business accounts that matched the embezzlement patterns Emma had flagged. I revealed that I had let them believe I was struggling because I needed to see who they really were when they thought I had nothing to offer, and what I had seen was a pattern of emotional coercion and control that had started 11 years ago with the heirloom jewelry and never stopped. The room went dead silent for a heartbeat. Then my mother laughed a short, bitter sound full of contempt. She leaned forward, her eyes flashing with that hidden resentment she had nursed for years, and said, "Oh, please, Lauren, do not insult us with these fairy tales. You have always been the one chasing fantasies, while your older sister builds something real. If you had any real success, you would not have hidden it like a guilty secret now, would you?" The vicious jab hit hard, twisting my honesty into more proof that I was unreliable and deceptive. My father stared at the documents, his face cycling through shock, then a sudden quiet compromise, as he muttered that maybe we could discuss this privately later to avoid damaging the family image. It was the disappointing pivot I had feared, the outburst, giving way to the same old desire for peace at any cost. My older sister shook her head, saying this was exactly why she had warned everyone about my unpredictable nature, while Derek added that secrets like this only proved I was not thinking about the family's future. My fiancé looked at me as if I had become a stranger, his face pale with betrayal. He asked why I had never told him the truth, his voice cracking with hurt and confusion. I tried to explain that I had needed to know if our relationship could survive without the masks, but my mother jumped in before I could finish, cutting across me with another psychological blow. "See, Brandon, this is what I meant," she said, her tone laced with false sympathy. "She has been playing all of us for fools, and now she expects us to believe her sudden wealth will fix everything. It is classic Lauren, always the dramatic one, who cannot simply support the people who raised her." The words landed like the final slap, exposing how she had turned my test against me, painting me as the villain in front of the man I loved. My fiancé stood up slowly, shaking his head, and said he needed time to process that the woman he thought he knew had been someone else entirely. He left the room without another word, and I felt the irreversible consequence settle in my chest because I knew in that moment the relationship was already fracturing beyond repair. Madison ended the call abruptly, her expression tight with discomfort, clearly wanting no part of the family drama that had just unfolded. My mother turned back to me, her face flushed, but still in control, saying that none of this changed the fact that the business needed the merger and that if I truly cared, I would sign the paperwork she had prepared to consolidate the shares under my older sister's name for stability. She slid the documents across the table, her eyes daring me to refuse. I looked at the pages, then at my father, who had gone quiet again, his earlier fire reduced to a resigned sigh, as he said, "Perhaps it was better to let cooler heads decide later." The painful choice crystallized. Right there, I could fight and risk losing everything, including the last threads of family, or I could walk away, preserving my self-respect, but accepting the isolation that would follow. I stood up, gathered my folder, and looked my mother directly in the eyes, for the first time without the mask. I told her I would not sign anything, and that I was done letting her use guilt and sarcasm to control my life. The words felt freeing, but the room erupted in protests, my older sister accusing me of abandoning the family when they needed me most, while my mother delivered one last cutting remark. "Fine, Lauren," she said coldly. "If that is how you want to repay everything we have done for you, then do not expect any of us to be there when your little tech bubble bursts." It was the emotional isolation I had feared, the boundaries I set, costing me the very connections I had once hoped to save. My fiancé never came back inside that night, and 2 days later he sent a short message saying he could not be with someone who had hidden such a fundamental part of herself, no matter the reason. The breakup landed like the final weight of defeat, because in choosing myself, I had lost the one person who had made the last 17 months feel safe. My mother's retail chain continued to struggle, the merger talks stalled, after the drama leaked through community gossip, but she spun the narrative to friends and relatives, claiming I had overreacted and created unnecessary conflict out of jealousy toward my older sister. The family gatherings went on without me, my father sending occasional texts that grew shorter and more distant, as if even he had chosen the path of least resistance to keep the peace. I kept my apartment, my job, and the life I had built quietly, but the evenings felt heavier now, filled with the regret of knowing I had exposed the truth, only to watch it change nothing in the end. My mother remained the same unyielding force, her emotional coercion intact, and her hold on the family stronger in the absence of my questions. I had made the painful choice to walk away, preserving my dignity, but the cost was the quiet loneliness of self-respect, without the closure or justice I had once imagined. Emma stayed in touch, meeting me for coffee, and reminding me that choosing myself was never supposed to feel like a victory parade. But I still woke up some mornings, wondering if there had been another way, a path where I could have kept my fiancé and some fragment of family without sacrificing the boundaries I finally drew. The lesson my grandmother taught me about character had proven true, but it had come at a price I was still learning to carry alone. I sat by my window one evening, looking out at the Denver lights, and touched the simple necklace my grandmother had left me, feeling the weight of every decision that had led me here. The woman who had raised me had shown her true colors when she thought I had nothing, and in the end, that truth had set me free, but left me standing in the silence of my own making. Thank you for listening to my story. I never thought sharing this would feel so raw, but if you have ever had to make a painful choice that left you isolated even when you knew it was right, please tell me in the comments what you chose and how you carried the regret, because hearing your experiences helps me remember I am not the only one walking this path.